Trump does not recognize, and I genuinely doesn't realize this, he doesn't realize that that's not free money. That is a tax, and that is a tax on his constituents. He does not clock that at all.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, once again, I'm delighted to say, is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Scott, how are you doing?
Hey, I get to be here with you, Fergus, on Tariff Liberation Day, part 2.
Absolutely, part 2. But it's always a pleasure to have you on. You sort of teased a little bit there of what we're going to start on. It is also a slightly different episode today because the US president is currently on UK shores as we're speaking. His visit to his Tunbury golf course in Scotland, of course. And we did get some big news out of the trip last night. After he met with the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Trump announced the US had reached a trade deal with the EU, which he called the biggest deal ever made. Summing up, 15% tariffs on most EU goods entering America. That's more than the UK, but down on the 30% that was threatened. Scott, you know how politics works. I'm sure both sides at the moment are trying to claim this as a victory. Is it a good deal?
First of all, beyond the spin that's going to come out, it's not a victory for anyone. And I'm going to repeat what I've said for months, especially since Trump's magic tariff chart on April the 2nd. The original Tariff Liberation Day. Nobody wins in a tariff contest. If this is a 15% tariff, and I'll explain why that's not even certain at this point, the first people who lose out on this are not Europeans, they're Americans, Trump's own constituents, because a tariff is a charge on American importers. And American importers either have to swallow that charge, reducing their profits, or they have to pass it on to American manufacturers, American consumers, American farmers. That means that inflation will go up in the United States. When inflation goes up, it means it's much more difficult to bring interest rates down. When you can't bring interest rates down, the U.S. will pay a greater charge on its already record $36 trillion government debt. It will take time to see the economic effects, but no one wins in the US. Now in the EU manufacturers, EU exporters, EU farmers don't win, not because they pay that 15% charge, but because it could reduce the demand for their products. So the EU takes a hit as well. Second point, which is important, is this is not a deal yet. And this is also true with the UK, by the way, with Keir Starmer meeting Donald Trump today.
I mentioned that myself with Justin Wolfers on the Trump Report just a few months ago.
Well, Justin Wolfers, man, he is my go-to on a lot of the economic side. So Justin can explain it better than I can, but I'll recap. And that is, it is a framework for a deal. The framework is, rather than the 30% that Trump suddenly announced a few weeks ago, and there's an important context I'll add in a minute, 15% on most goods would be the starting point. However, there is a lack of clarity on a number of clauses. There's actually a silver lining for some EU products, and that is that 15% tariff would be an all-in tariff, the way the EU reads it. Now, there are certain products, I'm speaking to you from Ireland, where I was talking to dairy exporters. They pay a 16% tariff already to the United States under a bespoke World Trade Organization agreement. Now, if this 15% comes into force and is inclusive, they've caught a break, right? They're no longer paying 16% to charge, they're paying 15%. So they're out there. I'm not saying they got champagne out there or even like vats of milk they're going to open up today, but they're relieved. Now, let's talk about a couple of other sectors which are not clear, both for the UK and for the EU. For the EU, it's cars. And we know that Trump was slapping 25% or 27.5% on cars. This is important to countries like Germany, like Sweden, for example, and to the UK. Now, the Germans are saying, And Friedrich Merrick's the Chancellor saying is, we've got a 15% on cars as well as on other products. Now, I'm waiting to see the confirmation of that in the clauses in the agreement. If that is the case, 15% is still more than a 10% charge on UK cars that Starmer has been trying to get, but it's not the 25%, so the EU can probably wear that. Steel is a problem. 50% tariff on steel. Now, that's right now, that's on the UK as well as on the EU. And that is a problem because there are a lot of German steel manufacturers who are not happy with this. But again, to take this back to the United States, if you were going to be, and Trump says, I want you to come back and make cars in the United States, right? His excuse for these tariffs, which doesn't wash, but I can explain why. If you were to move your factory back to the United States right now, you need steel for your cars. So you've moved your entire factory back to the United States doing automobiles, and you're paying 50% more on your steel that you get from Europe, or by the way, from a place like Mexico. So, so those clauses are really are not nailed down at this point. That said, if, and this is what's come out from Friedrich Merz today, this would be my reading on Ursula von der Leyen's statement, the European Commission president yesterday. This is my reading of Maros Sefcovic, who was the chief EU negotiator today. If those clauses are nailed down, and this is an inclusive tariff, and if there are no heavy surcharges on anything else except steel, then I think the EU, this is not a good deal, but the way they're framing it is the best deal we could get in bad circumstances.
And I know you on this show before, I think you called Donald Trump an economic moron around the subject of tariffs. So putting aside slightly whether you think this is the right policy or not, in Donald Trump's mind, surely is he going to be delighted today? Because, this has been his sort of whole strategy from the start, and EU tariffs have gone from, I think, an average of 1.5 to 15 overnight. Is he sitting here thinking, job done?
Yeah, he will do, but I'm now going to repeat, he's going to think that not because he is economically literate, he is still an economic moron. His staff think he's an economic moron. And let me explain this with the important context. 3 weeks ago, US negotiators and the EU negotiators worked for weeks to hammer out a deal, and that deal was on a 10% tariff. There were also clauses on car and steel where there were some concessions that were made as well. That was put on Trump's desk. Now, the US negotiators were really happy with this. Trump wouldn't sign it. I think I know why Trump wouldn't sign it, which I can tell you in a second if you want. He comes out 3 days later, either out of his own head or because of certain advisors, wants Peter Navarro to watch, and he says, we're going to have the 30% tariff. His own staff know that he and some advisors in the White House are running not an economically literate approach, it's an extortion racket. And you need to call it as that. Because what Trump thinks is, oh my God, tariffs are like bonus money. They're like the money that I can bring in as the boss. I won't say organized crime, that would be bad. I can bring it in like the boss, like a little mafiosi here, right? He says, and he'll go out there, he'll go on True Social today and he'll say, we're going to bring in trillions of dollars of revenue. Peter Navarro, his fire-breathing advisor, has been saying this as well, trillions of dollars of revenue. Trump does not recognize, and I genuinely doesn't realize this, he doesn't realize that that's not free money. That is a tax, and that is a tax on his constituents. He does not clock that at all, but he's still going to play it politically like it's free money. And if he gets enough people to believe him, even if he's economically illiterate, he still wins out on this politically. The problem here is he doesn't win out on it economically, because you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool the markets and you can't fool economic fundamentals. He cannot magically make inflation come down. And I'll just give you one thing where the politics and the economics will clash. Once you get beyond Trump's base, his net approval rating already, right now, on inflation is minus 25%. Across all Americans surveyed, he has about 62%, 63% who disapprove of the way he's handling inflation. And that number is only going to go up when the effects of this happen. So yeah, Trump will celebrate it, and that's fine. But the reality is going to be what matters in the longer run.
And on the subject of inflation, and you mentioned there a tax on your constituents, obviously, economics for a lot of people can be quite difficult to understand. I just want to go to the simple question. If sort of these tariffs of 15% are coming in, is it as simple as an American consumer, if you're buying something from the EU now, it will cost 15% more?
No, because it depends on how much is passed on by, say, the manufacturer that pays a 15% increase in component charges, or by the importer who has a European product, whether they swallow part of the tariff or whether they pass it all across. What we've seen so far is that U.S. importers are passing part of the cost across to the consumers, but they are swallowing some of this. And here's what the immediate effect took place, even before today. General Motors, the American car manufacturer, reported $1.3 billion loss in revenues in the last quarter. Now, they took a huge hit, right? If you talk about Stellantis, which is a U.S. company, but also has European, basically it's a multinational. Stellantis, I think, reported 1.2 billion in terms of a loss. So they're taking the hit because they're not passing all of those charges across to consumers. But at some point, they can't keep taking those losses. If you talk about products, food, and so on, again, what I think you're going to see is you get this mixed bag arrangement, which is like if you're buying Irish butter or Irish cheese, which is really good, by the way.
The best butter in the world, some people would say.
Exactly. There you go. Well, I just talked to the guys from the Irish Dairy Board a few days ago, so thank you for the plug. They catch a break, but other food products don't. They don't have like a WTO tariff, which is being replaced. So that's American consumers can see increases. If they're eating avocados, or them fancy things. But of course, those are probably just the pointy-headed liberals. So the Trumpists may not care about that. It is going to be a steady increase in the rate of inflation. And I'm going to walk people back to a fundamental that I think may have been forgotten in all this. Coming out of 2024, and you probably wouldn't have noted on the election coverage because it was pretty poor in the U.S. U.S. inflation was coming down. It was coming down sharply. It was 9% in 2022. It was down around about 3%, and it was dropping at the end of 2024. The Federal Reserve was counting on the fact that if the U.S. inflation rate keeps coming down, we will be lowering interest rates on a step-by-step basis in 2025, right? As soon as Trump took office, because of the chaos he unleashed in the U.S. government, that plan went out the window. They could no longer bring the interest rates down because here's another economic fundamental. When you have the risk of an inflationary spike, the worst thing you can do with interest rates is to bring them down because it just fuels the economy even more. And so what happened is that the Federal Reserve's, plans that had been laid out, they had to kind of put them on the side. And that's meant sort of an ad hoc American economic approach. And it will not settle. It will not settle over the next few months, which means I'm going to add a couple of political points in just a minute. I'm going to take a pause that I think go beyond this deal, where I think the EU is calculating politically why they took a bad deal.
So in your mind, why has the EU taken a bad deal?
I think there's a couple of calculations beyond the headlines. And remembering it's just a framework, so emphasize it. I think there's probably three things that come into play. I think the first is that the EU looks at this and they probably figure, look, the first hit on this is going to be on Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that the EU gets away unscathed like we've just discussed, but like they take, politically, this is going to cause trouble for Trump and his inner circle. So, look, give the mafia bosses 15% rather than the 30% for the near term, And it's going to be his own constituents that are going to start to get frustrated. So we're not going to front up to him yet. So we will wear the 15. I mean, I knew from talking to people past few weeks, I knew that everybody was saying they thought the landing would be 10%, right? So we knew the EU could take 10. Okay, they'll take a 15% tariff. Now, we hope then that the Trump camp, maybe not Trump himself, but the adults in the room in the Trump administration start trying to pull back on this, and they row back, right? That's especially true if the EU says, in exchange for getting the 15, we get concessions on automobiles, for example, and on certain and on other sectors. Secondly, there are a couple of really important provisions in terms of security, and that is, I think the EU has been wanting to lock in the Trump administration on the security of Ukraine versus the Russia invasion, and more broadly on the security of Europe, because not just Trump, but people in the administration like J.D. Vance have been threatening to do a walk on Europe since the start of the administration. And when Donald Trump comes out and proclaims the EU is going to spend $600 billion on defense products, right? Well, that's true, probably. But that's because the EU is planning on increasing the purchase of U.S. military equipment as part of a broader plan for Ukrainian and European security. As you know, accompanying 800 billion euros in investment over the next 5 years. That's the target set by Ursula von der Leyen. You get the U.S. equipment in that Trump was refusing to give the Ukrainians and refusing to give to the European, to sell to the Europeans. Now the Americans are going to be selling it when you talk about jet fighters, when you talk about armor, when you talk about advanced electronic equipment. So the EU is quite happy. And by the way, that helps them then, if they're NATO members as well, it helps them meet that target or moving towards that mythical 5% target of defense spending, of 5% of GDP on defense spending. The other clause is the purchase of American energy products, which is $750 million over 3 years, 750 billion, I should say. So $750 billion over 3 years. The EU wants that because the EU has a target of ending all Russian energy imports by 2027. They don't want dependence on Russia for obvious reasons. They want to keep ramping up their sanctions on the Russians. There are certain EU members that are holding out against that because they say, oh, we need Russian energy products. Hungary, Slovakia, to an extent, Czech Republic. Well, now you can say, look, you've got American oil, American liquefied natural gas, American nuclear fuel. We're bringing it in. So the EU gets those security benefits off of this deal. And that's quite important, right? The third thing is we're in a massive realignment in terms of international trade, economics, and indeed political partnerships. Nobody can rely on the Trump administration. Nobody. So what the EU is going to do, as well as others like the UK, is you're going to start looking for other partners. And it's interesting that the story that got swallowed up because of what happened yesterday is the UK-India trade deal from last week, which was huge for the Starmer government, right? And think about that the UK, in a post-Brexit environment with serious economic difficulties because of cutting itself off from the EU, they can't count on a US trade deal, a full US trade deal. So they realign, they look for other partners. Same thing for India. They got burned pursuing a US trade deal earlier this year. They look to the UK. India is going to look to the EU for a deal. The Canadians are negotiating with Australia, with India, EU, other partners as well.
The Canadians still haven't come to terms with the US, have they?
No, they haven't, because Trump just simply slapped that 25% on cars immediately and on other sectors from the get-go, and has kept on threatening increased tariffs. Remember that when he said, I'm going to put 30% tariffs on the EU, he also said, I think it's 30 to 35% on Mexico and Canada on all goods. And that threat is still out there, as far as I know. So, so everybody is like buying time. They are buying time to see where they can go for other deals. The EU was hoping they could get somewhere with China. That's not going to happen. That summit did not go well this past week. But at least they bought some time by getting only a 15% rather than a 30% tariff as they try to make these maneuvers.
I'm pleased you used that phrase, buying time, because when this deal came out last night, it actually came as something as a little bit of a surprise. I think Donald Trump said earlier in the day the chances were at 50-50. Is it cynical to suggest that now would have been the perfect time for Trump to announce something like this, considering the difficult week he's had in the last week with everything involving Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, certainly, if not for Trump, for his diehard supporters, it was a convenient time to try to change the news cycle. But I'm going to give you a newsflash: that ain't going to work. First of all, economics is really difficult, boys and girls, and so it's hard to make economic stories run. Now, it is on the front pages of like New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. But when I last checked, it was not the lead story on Fox, right? Because Fox didn't want to have to go that way. They're going to go for the sensational stuff. And the thing about the Epstein story that makes it so different is these aren't the Democrats causing trouble for Trump on Epstein. These aren't the pointy-headed liberals. These aren't, the swamp or whatever, whoever he wants to blame. These are his own supporters. These are his own supporters who are saying, you didn't come clean with us on the Epstein files. And that does not come clean until one of two things happens. Either he releases some material on Epstein to satisfy them, or he completely ditches them, as he almost threatened to do a couple of weeks ago by calling them weaklings. Now, the problem for Trump is he can't completely ditch these folks. He relies them on too much to make social media noise. He relies on them too much in Congress, because some of these diehard folks, diehard conspiracy theorists, are now inside the Congress. Some of them are inside his administration. So, the thing about August is August tends to be a very quiet season politically in DC because everybody goes home. Precisely because everybody goes home, there's going to be a news vacuum. Trump can't come up with a magic trade deal every day of August. And in that vacuum, the Epstein story is going to run and run, especially with developments like will Ghislaine Maxwell testify, either before Congress or in court, which is going to occupy folks for a while. So now Trump basically, look, you live by the conspiracy theory. One day, the conspiracy theory is going to bite you in the butt.
Mm. I should mention, of course, that Trump hasn't been accused of any formal wrongdoing or charged with a crime. But when you say there, he's got sort of two options: release them or, get rid of this part of his support, which you say he's not going to do that. I mean, it seems quite unlikely he's going to release them as well. So in that case, this is just not going away? Is he going to be stuck in some sort of stasis?
Third option is blame everyone else, right? Shoot everybody else. And so that was Trump's stump last week when the birthday card story came out. And it's like, yeah, okay, boys and girls, the Wall Street Journal is not like Rupert Murdoch's other publications. It's not like the New York Post, and it's not like Fox. These boys don't go and print a story without solid info. So when they say Trump did a birthday lewd, crude doodle for Epstein, I suspect they've seen that. And I suspect indeed, because other outlets are now reporting who else gave Epstein wishes, I suspect other people now have seen that birthday collection. So Trump comes out and says, I'm going to sue him for $10 billion, $10 billion with a B. They're going to pay up. And it's like for 24, 48 hours, he's like, Wall Street Journal, the enemy.
And I think this whole story, we'll just end with this. Is it encapsulated perhaps by a president who in the past has been quite willing to indulge with conspiracies and online theories, and now he sort of unwittingly finds himself at the center of it as the president?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. As my grandfather would say, you live by it, don't complain when it bites you in the butt. And the fact is that in 2016, this is not the only reason why Donald Trump won the election, just as his cooperation with the Russians was not the only reason he's won. But he did get a lot of support by the conspiracy theorists who were surging at that point because of the spread of social media and the spread of the internet. In that year of 2016, there was an incident called Pizzagate. Now, Pizzagate was a conspiracy theory which had no basis in truth, that Democrats were hanging out in a pizzeria in the basement in Washington, D.C., and they were plotting their pedophilia. This was one of the core hoaxes that was spread by the QAnon movement. Now, the thing about the QAnon movement is that it became part of the diehard support for Donald Trump. And indeed, there are certain representatives now in the US Congress who are linked to QAnon. Donald Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, was a very key figure in QAnon, right? So Trump relies on that support with QAnon, and he doesn't distance himself from it. Indeed, when he loses office in 2021, remember, there are more conspiracy theories that come out there. For example, January 6th was not a Trump coup attempt. He says it was a conspiracy by the FBI and the deep state against him. And because he doubles down on the conspiracy theories, it just stacks up and up and up. And it's interesting. I mean, because conspiracy theory is not new. Ever since I was a boy, the idea of who shot John F. Kennedy, for example, right? And we've lived
But those questions are still being asked.
And they're still being asked. But there's a difference between Kennedy and between this case. And that is, look, at the end of the day, we're not going to know who was behind Oswald, if there were people, right? And the fact is that story moves much more slowly because there's just like a few more documents that you could kind of bring out. And there were a few more that were brought out this year. In this case, however, this conspiracy started in the hypercharged world of the internet. It didn't start back in 1963. And in the hypercharged world of the internet, these things just escalate and they just snowball until you come up with some type of way of either closing them off or where people burn out in terms of their interest. This doesn't get closed off, and I don't think, I'm just trying to think what the diversion Trump can create that would be so big that this would close off this conspiracy theory. And at this point, I can't see it.
Well, I'm sure we will continue following this story closely on the Trump Report. Scott Lucas, thank you very much for joining us as always.
Thanks. Stay safe, stay sane.